All right. A very, very good evening to all of you, and probably good afternoon and good morning to others in different part of the world, especially to Bob and Jan. A very, very good afternoon. I'm considering myself very fortunate in welcoming all of our guests, such esteemed, august audience here. As we all know, every beginning has an end, and especially human life culminates in death. We have started our centenary celebration this January with a bang. And then there was quite a lot of ups and downs because of the COVID situations and lockdown. Unfortunately, as much as we wanted to, we couldn't have any live seminars or any live in person functions. But fortunately, because of this digital, well, enhancement, this capability, the expansion of our capability, we could still meet, not only meet, we actually could invite people all over the world. And that is why we are here having Bob and John. And in our audience, we are having friends like Anthony, Small, Louis, and other people. Even our candidates and members from Mumbai chapter, Delhi chapter, and elsewhere. So, welcome you all again. And today, the topic of our webinar is also similar to the beginning of an end or the end itself, the death, but not exactly the death. Probably we would be looking at how different people, the stalwarts like Klein, like Winnicot, how they looked at death, how they took the meaning or the essence of it, what they made of Freud's coming on to much later in his career and in his theory, writing about beyond the pleasure principle and giving death instinct a space. Well, let's see what space Klein provides and Winnicott provides it. So we would be hearing from our esteemed August invitees. We are all eager to hear from Bob and John. And I'm very fortunate to introduce first Bob and later on John. Well, Professor Robert Douglas Hinselwood, very dearly known as Bob, is a man of numerous merits. A psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, he's a deep thinker. Not only a prolific writer, he has founded and edited a number of journals, including the British Journal of Psychotherapy, Psychoanalysis, and History. He is a nerdy octogenarian, actively engaged in teaching and discussions. He's authored many, many books on many areas, like his interest in application of psychoanalytic ideas in social sciences, organizations, and mental health institutions culminated in writing and editing many books, such as Therapeutic Communities, which was later co-edited with the same name as a series. Later, he wrote about groups and other organizing other books. So soon as the beginning of 2000, there were three books, one after another each year, observing organization, thinking about institutions and organizations, anxiety and defense. He also wrote Therapy or Coercion and Suffering Insanity related to similar themes. He has widely researched and written many books, not only on Beyond, but especially on Klein and her work, among which my all-time favorite is his graphically illustrated Melanie Klein for Beginners. We are having this class of Klein, I'm teaching Klein, and my students are fascinated with your graphics and the illustrations. So that is still my favorite, though it's a book for beginners. His Dictionary of Kleinian Thought and Clinical Klein, and the recent one, Melanie Klein, The Basics, are all about different aspects of the same. With John, he has written The Clinical Paradigms of Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicot, of which we will get to see a sample in our webinar today. Their dialogue between the Kleinian thought and the Winnicottian thought. His research on couch, which is about the single case studies, subjectivity, and psychoanalytic language and knowledge, is a book in itself. And also on beyond sources, which is shaping of his paradigms, and the very recent one about countertransference and alive moments. Now, not taking much time, let me hand it over to you, Bob.
Well, Bharti, thank you. Thank you for inviting us and for the opportunity to continue the dialogue that Jan and I have started a long time ago now, when we were both at the University of Essex. I have a written presentation, which I hope will take 20 to 30 minutes. I thought I'd put the text on the screen as I read it, so that it will be, well, you can absorb it either way, eyes or ears. So I will try to share the screen now. How do I do that? It's not sharing now.
Yeah, there is the share screen just below.
There, I've got it now.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see.
Yes, we can see it now, and you can slowly scroll it as you go along with it.
So I will just read this, but I will read it slowly. At the time Freud introduced his new idea of the death instinct, there seemed to be an obligation for analysts to adopt his new ideas. This was in 1920, in a period when psychoanalysis achieved some acclaim, as it was the form of psychology, the only form of psychology that could explain the epidemic of war neurosis in the Great War. It was also the time when there were important defections which rocked the psychoanalytic movement, notably Adler and Jung. And also, forensics seemed to be going astray with strong disapproval from Freud. So the acceptance of the death instinct was caught between the new success of Freud's achievements and a considerable incomprehension of what his theory of a death instinct really meant. Not many of Freud's followers could really follow him here, and yet they could not deviate. In fact, Freud himself was quite hesitant about this new idea. Now, today, it seems to me that analysts employ the idea of the death instinct to attribute its use to others who they want to dismiss. Well, Freud's view came after the First World War, when so many people had died. It came out of his concern about the repetition compulsion and the associated phenomenon of the negative therapeutic reaction. He had an idea, too, that it might be connected with sexual masochistic fantasies. And he wanted to associate it to biological death, the fate of all organisms, and in physics, the law of entropy. It became a general sense of running down, and he was himself more than 60 years of age when he turned his mind to death. So I want, first of all, to start with a problem which I think has made it difficult for all subsequent analysts to embrace. Freud presented the death instinct as comparable but opposite to libido, or the life instinct, as he then started to call it. He had evolved his theory of the libido from 1905 in 3 essays on sexuality and its many revisions. Libido is the name for an instinctual need stimulated by erotic zones on the skin, typically the mouth, the anus, and the genitals. An instinctual impulse results from tactile stimulation and has to be discharged in some direct sexual satisfaction or in some non-sexual sublimation. But death instinct is not at all like that. There were no skin zones specifically stimulating impulses to death. In fact, the only stimulus for the death instinct appears to be the life instinct. That makes it an instinct stimulated by an instinct, which is not at all the same. And often, some analysts seem to think that the death instinct is not the response to stimuli at all. It is just there, hiding darkly all the time. These contrasts seem to go against the nature of an instinct. And it implies, I think, a lack of real thought about what something like a death instinct could be. It's not surprising that there has been no real focus on what it is, and therefore how it could be observed and inferred. Well, my interest, as Bharti has told you, is in Klein and Bion. And this occasion invites us to follow them and Winnicot, what they all made of this concept. Bion, as you may know, never used the term death instinct in his published work. Klein did, out of a loyalty to Freud and psychoanalysis in the 1920s, as she was no doubt mindful of the fate of Adler and Jung. Klein was not an instinct theorist, and the term never meant much to her. She was not a biologist, nor was she trained medically or scientifically. She did not use the energy model and never used the terms psychic energy or economic model. She did, however, tend to use the terms libido and death instinct, but as terms for feelings, as if she didn't distinguish feelings from instincts, and typically the feelings of love and hate. However, late in her work, she did accept that there was a self-destructive element in the human mind, and something more than the superego as Freud described it. In fact, Bion coined the phrase the self-destructive superego for a severe self-punishment. They both thought there was something more than a harshly punitive superego. And in her later work on schizoid mechanisms, she did infer a deliberate act of the ego to split itself up either into two parts, following Freud's description of the fetishist, or into disintegrated fragments. And we do know that suicide is a common enough event in the minds and often in the acts of mentally ill people. She, however, did not make much use of Freud's new paper, and her mentor, Karl Abram in Berlin, never mentioned the death instinct at all. However, self-destructive attacks on the mind or on the body was recognized by Klein and her followers and regarded as a defensive maneuver stimulated by specific, intolerable experiences. However, there is also another important distinction. Love and hate do not happen on their own. They are emotions arising in a relationship with someone else, either in the real world or imagined. For Klein, emotions arise in relation to these real others and not just as an impulse to find others for satisfaction. So it's worth going back to consider the divergence between instinct theory and object relations theory in psychoanalysis. The instinct theory tradition developed especially in Vienna, and when transported to the USA in the late 1930s, it was strongly influenced by the behaviorist research into drive theory by experimental psychologists. It held an increasingly objective view of human psychology and experience. But that objectivity has now been slowly rejected in USA psychoanalysis. Object relations developed in parallel to this instinct theory and in Britain rather than the USA. It started with a revision in technique. As in all science, a new investigative tool produces new data, and then a revision of the standard generalizations. As, for instance, Galileo's use of the telescope led him to discover the moons of Jupiter many centuries ago. When Klein, with the encouragement of Ferenczi and Abram, decided to analyze children, she needed a new tool, an approach which did not rely so much on verbal communication. And as you know, she developed her play technique, in which she encouraged children to express themselves with toys rather than words. And as I say, a new technique led to new discoveries. Because it was obvious that in play, children personify their toys, she showed that it is the relations between persons that is basic to children's mental states. And in particular, it is the problem a child has to solve when hating someone whilst at the same time loving them as a needed object. Well, and as a loved object as well. Now, here's an example from Melanie Klein, Rita, who is one of her first child patients in 1923. Rita, aged 2 3/4. She was aged 2 3/4. After a ceremonial, which was plainly obsessional, her doll was tucked up to go to sleep, and an elephant was placed by the doll's bed. The idea was that the elephant should prevent the child from getting up. Otherwise, the latter, that is the child, would steal into its parents' bedroom and either do them some harm or take something away from them. Now, the elephant, as she says, was a father imago, was to act the part of a person who prevents. In Rita's mind, her father, by a process of introjection, already filled this role ever since, at the time she was 1.25 to 2 years old, she had wished to usurp her mother's place with him, to steal away the child with which her mother was pregnant, and to injure and castrate both parents. The reactions of rage and anxiety which took place when the child was punished in these games showed that in her own mind, Rita was enacting both parts, that of the authorities who inflicted punishment and that of the child who received it. So Rita, in her own mind, was consumed by these relationships, both a rageful attack on her parents and a rigid need to prevent herself from hurting them. It was this kind of conflict that Klein reduced to the problem of the life instinct versus the death instinct, that is, love versus hate. For Klein, this inherent conflict was the ultimate source of all anxiety. In English, I don't know what you say in India, but in English, we talk about biting the hand that feeds you. Recent reviews by Kleinians of the death instinct as a clinical occurrence have been made by Herbert Rosenfeld, Hannah Siegel, and Michael Feldman. Hannah Siegel said, Klein used Freud's concept of the duality of instincts in her clinical work, but mainly she addressed herself to the conflict between love and hate for the object, of the object. And Siegel, in fact, I think, remained in doubt as to clinical usefulness and the more precise meaning of death instincts. Now, in 1957, Klein evolved her ideas on the death instinct to focus attention on envy by associating envy to the death instinct concept. She was indicating the self-destructive aspect of hating those people one needs. And Siegel described envy. The way primary envy is described by Melanie Klein is as a spoiling hostility at the realization that the source of life and goodness lies outside. It's an external relation with the actual object that is needed. It is the dependence on the hand that feeds is what makes us bite it. And Mike Feldman confirmed Klein developed a powerful explanatory model to account for these phenomena, which she regarded as usually driven by a deadly envious process, the aim of which is to spoil and devalue, rendering everything the same and therefore useless. I'm suggesting their primary aim is not totally to destroy life, but to take the life out of it. And Feldman follows Betty Joseph and the way patients can deaden the quality of the contact between analyst and analysand. For instance, Joseph wrote a paper which she called Addiction to Near Death. Well, before finishing, it is worth perhaps indicating what is assumed to be inherent from the outset, from birth, and therefore in need of management in the present. From the beginning, there's an awareness of some other, but felt in very primitive terms. Those terms are whether the object satisfies or it frustrates. There is therefore an innate experience of satisfaction and frustration. Moreover, the object from which satisfaction or frustration comes is not an inner thing, but is assumed to have some experience, mental experience of its own, of satisfaction and pain as well. At the same time, since there is a relationship with that object, on the top of the satisfaction or frustration, there is a felt love for the satisfier and a felt hate for the frustrator. So from early on, and maybe from the very beginning, there's a development of the reality principle as described by Freud. All of these features of the endowed experiences may be exaggerated or minimized in ways that do not accord with the reality. And that corruption of reality can endure into adult life, leaving handicaps in the relations with others. So there's been a long evolution to the Kleinian idea of the death instinct, deviating probably a long way from Freud. In the long run, it has become a deadly response to the pain of dependence on the external object that gives and sustains life. That response is a depleting experience for both the subject and the object, and the relation between the two. It is this last step which I think Winnicot was not able to agree with. Thank you for listening and reading. Over to you, Jan. Or back to Bharti.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so very much. In such a small, dense paper, you have said a lot. And before I invite Jan, I just want to say a few words about Jan. So Professor Jan Abram, you're very welcome here. She's a training and supervising analyst of the British Psychoanalytic Society and in private practice in London. She's visiting professor of the psychoanalysis unit, University College London, and also vice president of the EPF, European Psychoanalytic Federation. She's visiting lecturer and supervisor at Tavistock Clinic, London. And 2016, she was a visiting professor for the University of Kyoto, Japan, where she has also taken a writing sabbatical. Since 2008, she has been a member of the Paris group, the research group of the EPF, and was its chair between 16 to 19. Jan has published quite a few books and articles, especially The Language of Winnicot. So she has researched a lot about Winnicot and wrote numerous books like The Language of Winnicot. And then there is the second edition of the same book. This also was just outstanding academic book of the year. There was another book about Winnicot is Donald Winnicott Today. This was also shortlisted for a Gradiva Award. Then the book that was co-authored with Professor Hinselwood, that was The Clinical Paradigm of Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott, Comparison and Dialogues. In September 21, her collection of clinical essays would be published, has already been published as The Surviving Object, Clinical Essays on Psychic Survival of the Object. So welcome, Jan. And now let's hear what Winnicott has to say. So would you like your presentation to begin with your presentation?
Jan is muted too. You're muted, Jan.
Just a minute. Well, Jan, you can unmute yourself.
You're in control, Bharti, of whether I speak or not.
All right. I'll take care of that.
Yes, okay. It's just every time I mute myself when Bob was speaking, then unmuting, you're in control.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay, all right.
Anyway, it's I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation, Bharti. It is an honor to be here, and wouldn't it have been lovely to have actually been there in person? But this is what we have to resort to. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity actually to have this discussion on the death instinct, which is such a difficult thing to discuss. We've never discussed it before, Bob and I. And I agreed with you, Bharti, that I thought Bob's presentation just now articulated and clarified many things that I think Winnicot had difficulties with in relation to the Kleinian development of the death instinct during his time. But he never really clarified absolutely what his disagreement was. So when you say, I'm going to give you what Winnicot's version is, I'm going to give you an interpretation of what I think Winnicot. It's the way in which I feel he was offering something different and something specific. But I want to share with you all before I go into the PowerPoint. This is a brief anecdote of a supervision group I did this week, where a patient was being presented who has great difficulties. I think, in fact, the patient is very traumatized. But I just want to tell you this, I can't go into the details about the patient, except that in the supervision, after what had happened is that the analyst had got ill and had to cancel several sessions. And when the patient came back, they asked for sessions online. And the supervisor, the analyst said, no, you have to come to the room. And after the analyst had presented her session with this patient, I said, I wonder if actually, I said something that I thought was extremely obvious. I wonder if the patient felt very anxious about what had happened to you in your absence. And I feel that what the patient is saying is something about the anxieties of having destroyed you. At the moment, they were feeling so dependent on you. So this fits in very much with what Bob has just said. And the supervisee said, but I'm the Kleinian, not you. And she assumed that because my paradigm is Winnicot, I don't get that kind of anxiety that every patient will feel about becoming dependent, and the anxiety that that sets up in the patient at every separation, depending on every patient's different constellation, different psychic constellation, which in Winnicot's work very, very much depends on what I've referred to since 1996, when I published Language of Winnicot, as the psychic environment. Because I think when Winnicot was referring to the environment, this is really what he was referring to. The other thing that I think is very interesting, Bob, in what you've said is that Siegel seems to have demonstrated her own equivocation about Melanie Klein's use of the term death instinct. And I think this was what Winnicot was getting at, was that you can't really refer to a life and death instinct if you're talking about love and hate. They're two very different things. And I think this is what I feel has come up in our different dialogues, that love and hate for Winnicot are developmental achievements based on the survival of the object, which is what I want to present now, which in Donald Winnicott today chapter 14, is where I really elaborate how I understand Winnicot's final contribution to theory on the use of an object. And I look at some archival notes, which I think consolidate his alternative to a death instinct. So, like many, many Freudians of his day, he never agreed with Freud's death instinct concept. And he certainly didn't agree with Melanie Klein's death instinct concept. And I think what you allude to, Bob, is exactly that they're two different concepts. There is the Kleinian so-called death instinct, and there's a Freudian death instinct. And I think they constitute different kinds of concepts. So what I would like to offer before we get into more dialogue, and I'm looking forward to speaking to all of you about this area of psychoanalysis, I would like to offer my interpretation of what I understand Winnicott to be conveying in the use of an object, which I think he took years to try and work out if we're really, there was no way that he disagreed with envy, hate, and sadism. He was working with those affects all the time in his clinical work, you can see. His disagreement with Melanie Klein is that it was innate. What he said is that aggression is benign and destruction is benign, and it's related to psychic survival. So with that in mind, thank you very much, Bharti. I've tried so often. I've got to get a new computer because I can't screen share.
It's okay.
And this is already 7 years old. So if you wouldn't mind, there are animations with this.
I hope all of you can see the screen share. Jan, can you?
Yes. Okay.
All right.
I can. Thank you. So here's the use of an object. I think Winnicott says in his very late work that he actually said he evolved some ideas and went to New York to give the paper The Use of an Object. Now, he invited himself. I don't know whether people know that. And I think that's very interesting. My hypothesis, because I don't think he ever says this very specifically, was that he didn't feel he had an audience in London. And for some reason, he felt he did in New York. It might have been related to Phyllis Greenacre, who was talking about early psychic development, might have been in reference to Anna Freud's work. I'm not sure why he thought the ego psychologists would be interested in his ideas. And I do think he had arrived at a particular paradigm change, as we, following Thomas Kuhn's terminology, that I don't think the ego psychologists in the New York Society had really understood, although it's not to say that they weren't very interested in what he had to say. So next slide, thank you. If we go on to number 2, the slide number 2, what he says, he adds, when he publishes Playing and Reality in 1971, he adds this, the use of an object and relating through identifications, which I think is related to early development in Freudian classical analysis. But what he wants to get across very, very clearly is the principle is that it's the patient and only the patient who has the answers. And by contrast, the analyst has to do the interpretative work. But interpreting must be related to the patient's ability. And it's that dynamic between analyst and patient that places the analyst outside the area of subjective phenomena. Now, slide 3, borderline case. He says the core of the patient's disturbance for what he refers to as the borderline case is psychotic. And in a recent paper that I published in the IJP on Winnicot's concept of trauma, there is no question that the psychotic core is related to the very severely traumatized infant. The presentation of psychoneurotic or somatic symptoms may come across in the analysis if the analysis goes well, but there's no fundamental change to the psychotic core. Now in slide 4, let's look at what he means by object relating. By the way, I'm going through my interpretation of the use of an object step by step in chronological order. What he says about object relating then in that paper in 1968 is that the subject has allowed certain alterations to take place and the subject is invested in the object, but the subject does remain an isolate. And there is no capacity yet for cross-identifications. This is chapter 7 in Playing in Reality, where he refers to cross-identifications as the ability to discern the other as separate. This is having achieved use of an object status, me from not me. In object relating, the subject has not yet arrived at that capacity. Whereas object usage, he says, is that the nature, this is slide 5, the nature of the object must be taken into account. Acceptance of the object's independent existence. And this signifies the change from relating to usage. And he's absolutely clear about this. It does not come about automatically. And then he gives us an example, slide number 6. 2 babies feeding at the breast. In clinical terms, the first baby is feeding on the self. There's no distinction yet between me and not me. And the second baby is feeding from an other than me source because the mother analyst has facilitated that transition, the transition from object relating to object usage. And I think this is a very succinct way in which we see a picture of the patient on the couch. Are they feeding really on the analyst? Are they really making use of the analyst? Or are they actually in a solipsistic kind of defensive system as a defensive way of relating, which in Winnicot's terms would be object relating and not object usage. Number 7 then, slide, he refers to a paradox. He says the essential feature in the concept of transitional objects and phenomena is the paradox and acceptance of the paradox. Is that the baby creates the object, but the object was waiting to be created. And you never ask, did you create this or did you find it? This is the absolute law of the parent, not to ask the baby that question, but to accept it. And this again, it's always relational with Winnicott. The baby can only create the object if the object is waiting to be created. This relates to his whole theory of illusion of omnipotence. Slide number 8 is related to the capacity to develop. The capacity to use an object is not inborn. The transition from object relating to object usage depends on, yes, maturational processes and a facilitating environment. In other words, the mother in a state of primary maternal preoccupation. So in slide number 9, let's look at the sequence of transition. Winnicot makes clear that the most difficult thing in human development is this transition, the subject's placing of the object outside the area of omnipotent control, so that the subject can perceive the object as an external phenomenon, not a projective entity. There is then a recognition of the object as a separate entity. And this must be related also, I think, related to the transition that Freud refers to from the pleasure principle to the reality principle. Now, slide number 10 is this use of the term destruction that Winnicot uses. I pointed out in Language of Winnicot that he evolved his ideas on aggression. This was his life's work in a way. What does aggression? What is this aggression that we are born with? And how does it evolve? And of course, the use of an object was his kind of answer to that question. So destruction is really crucial. It is the change from object relating. It's at the center of the change from object relating to usage. And it's caused by the subject's destruction of the object. After subject relates to object, subject destroys object as it becomes external, and object survives destruction by subject. And this is slide number 11, the new feature that arrives. So in 1968, really, this is what he wanted to take to New York. This is the new feature of his theory of aggression, but he doesn't put it quite like that. And again, as I said earlier, it's my interpretation of what he was getting at. The subject says to the object, I destroyed you, and the object is there to receive the communication. Hello, object, I destroyed you, I love you, you have value for me because of your survival of my destruction of you. While I am loving you, I am all the time destroying you in, and he puts in brackets, unconscious fantasy. This is the moment fantasy begins for the individual. This is the new feature. But as you can see, it doesn't mean anything. Destruction doesn't mean anything unless there is an object there psychically surviving. So what we get is at the core of the use of an object paper is survival of the object. It is due to the survival of the object that the subject may live a life in the world of objects, meaning external objects. And along with the acceptance of ongoing destruction, and I will elaborate on that in a moment, this position can be arrived at in the early stages of emotional growth. I mean, I think he's really saying that this can be, that the cumulative effect of this can be arrived at in the early months of the infant's life, but it's only through the actual survival of the object. And I think that's something that hopefully we can get to in the discussion. So moving on, because I do want to get on to the discussion, to the 13th slide, central postulate then is that the subject does not destroy the subjective object. He distinguishes between the internal object, which he disagrees with in Melanie Klein's theory, although I think he's an object relationist. But in Melanie Klein's theory, internal objects are a given. For Winnicot, they are an accumulation of the relationship, the experience of early relating, object relating. And during those early moments, hours, days, months, what the baby is accumulating is a series of subjective objects, and they cannot be destroyed. Destruction is a central feature and use of an object. The object is objectively perceived, has autonomy, and belongs to shared reality. But destruction plays its part in making the reality and placing the object outside the self. Slide 14, creating the object. Finding reality means, for Winnicot, creating the object. And this depends on the object's capacity to survive, which in action is a non-retaliation. So when the mother is hurt, she does not retaliate. Destructive activity in analysis is the patient's attempt to place the analyst in the world. Maximum destruction, that is, the object is not protected by the subject, is essential for the move to occur. So in slide 15, what we're talking about now is the analyst's survival that is not dependent on interpretative work. It's dependent on non-retaliation. The intactness, nevertheless, of psychoanalytic technique. In other words, the analyst is not passive. So many people say, oh, it's only holding. Well, only holding is extremely active, even if it's active only in the analyst's mind. One has to work very hard at being holding and being in that situation with a very attacking patient. And the retaliation, he says, is worse than the actual death of the analyst. I think this is so true. So I'm nearing the end of this PowerPoint. The roots of aggression then for Winnicot. Survival of the object affects the development of aggression in the newborn. The mother for Winnicot is the first person who has to survive the infant's actual impulse to destroy. This is the right moment, he says, in the child's development at the very beginning of life. And it's different from actual destruction, which means the object has not survived. So he's using the same term, destruction, and that is something I think we need to explore in the discussion. I'm suggesting, slide 17, that this is a new approach to aggression. Survival of the object is at the heart of Winnicot's theory of aggression. And inborn aggression is variable along with other inherited tendencies. He recognizes inherited tendencies. Freudian theory assumes that aggression is reactive to the encounter with the reality principle, but here the destructive drive creates externality, but only if the object survives. Slide 18, the exact moment of attack and survival. There is no anger in the destruction of the object. There could be joy at the object's survival. Arising out of this phase, the object is in fantasy, always being destroyed. And I want to say here that you have to think of psychic destruction, like psychic eating. We destroy the food we eat, but it doesn't mean to say that's done in anger or envious or anything other than our need to survive. In slide 19, the use, many patients, he says, can already make use of the objects. And of course, these are the patients that probably give us most pleasure at the beginning of any kind of analysis. And analysts need to recognize that many patients need the analyst to provide them with the capacity to use us. And this essentially is the analytic task. So the summary. Object usage means consideration of the nature of the object by the subject. The necessary sequence is subject relates to object, object is in process of being found instead of placed by the subject in the world, subject destroys object, object survives destruction, subject can use object because the object is still there. Destruction then becomes a backcloth for love of a real object, in the way that eating becomes the backcloth for love of life, one could say. Now, in the last 3 slides, what I'm saying very, very succinctly is my attempt or my interpretation, attempt at a kind of advance of what I feel Winnicot is saying and what I've presented in my recent book, The Surviving Object. The intrapsychic surviving object then is the dynamic sequence internalized through the mother's receptivity and ability to sustain continuity of psychic survival. And what comes about then is the infant's continuity of being, a sense of trust and omnipotence, but not a pathological omnipotence. It's more related to a sense of agency. At root, the intrapsychic surviving object is a subjective object that is made up of the experience of having been survived by the object. Slide 22 is my pictogram, if you like, of the dynamics of the intrapsychic surviving object, a mother introducing the third, because the father is essential in this paradigm, and there is no real intrapsychic surviving object without the father, but it is up to the mother whether she introduces the father or not. And this is also something I've developed in one of the chapters, a couple of the chapters in The Surviving Object. Now let's look at the intrapsychic non-surviving object, as I suggested, where there's a failure of both environment and object mother, a lack of holding, a falling forever, unthinkable anxiety, no protective ego support from the mother, and a catalogue of non-survival of the object that leads to an intrapsychic non-surviving object that actually grows, I would suggest. And I think this is the way in which I think of the patients that are referred to as very often this deadliness that comes in to the consulting room. And the pictogram that I've selected for the non-surviving object is René Magritte's 1920, this painting of, obviously, I think you'll all have your associations where the baby is traumatized and has to withdraw from the mother, who demands a holding from the infant. And of course, this is an extreme traumatic experience for the baby. So slide 25, the analytic task to receive and live through the transference. I know I'm saying something that is very obvious to every psychoanalyst: to allow the patient's projections, to sustain a non-retaliatory position, to remain thoughtful, to be in a state of free-floating attention, and to follow through both maternal and paternal functioning. So my final words really would be, I would like to say what Winnicot has said, which I've suggested is the main point, is that anger, hate, sadism, and envy are not innate. They are affects that are achieved, and they depend on the early psychic environment. To use an object, the subject must have developed a capacity to use objects. This capacity cannot said to be inborn, nor can its development in an individual be taken for granted. The development of a capacity to use an object is another example, Winnicot says, of the maturational process as something that depends on a facilitating environment. At the very beginning, the infant carries an innate disposition to survive. Object relating is essential to being able to survive. and the psychic environment either facilitates or distorts the nascent psyche. The positive value of destructiveness emanates from the object's survival of the destruction, which places the object outside the area in which projective mental mechanisms operate, so that a world of shared reality is created, which the subject can use and which can feed back into the subject. And this relates to Winnicott's use of the term enrichment of relationships. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, John. And may I invite both you and Bob to begin the dialogue.
Do you want to start, Jen? Or shall I say something?
Well, I responded a bit to your paper, so perhaps I'm sure you've got something to say.
Yes, we've dialogued a lot about this kind of thing. You've said a very great deal in your presentation that's gone right through the hugely extended developmental model that Winnicott produced and developed in a very consistent, directional sort of way through from the early 1940s for 30 years, didn't he? What I get out of it, what do I get out of it? Well, a sort of inspiration that we can think about these developmental processes, and then a sort of perplexity, because the inspiration is a sort of, at a rather generalized level. And I find myself jotting notes here. What does it actually mean when we talk about destruction? I wanted to put it a little bit in context, though, because my understanding is that Winnicott was an absolute Kleinian all the way through his life, in the sense that he accepted the idea of the depressive position, the evolution of this narrative of the object being destroyed and then the object surviving or being repaired, as perhaps Klein emphasized more the repair, whereas Winnicott emphasized survival, perhaps. But I think it's pretty clear, and Winnicott said in a paper towards the end of his life, late 60s was it, or maybe even 1970, that he completely accepted Klein's view of the depressive position. And it is interesting, isn't it, that around 1934, 1935, when Melanie Klein was working out the depressive position following the tragic death of her son, that this was the point at which Winnicott was at his most Kleinian. He was finishing his analysis with James Strachey and looking for an analysis with Melanie Klein. Eventually had an analysis with Joan Revere, didn't he, from the mid-30s. Joan Revere being one of the very closest of Klein's supporters at that time. within 10 years, Winnicot had changed his mind, hadn't he? And this was crystallized in his non-acceptance of Klein's paranoid schizoid position. And then there was a divergence of the ways. And Klein intended to ignore Winnicott, were rather aloof to what Winnicott was trying to develop. And he got rather protesting at first about that aloofness, and then formally sort of disengaged, didn't he, in the early to mid 50s, particularly over the paper on transitional objects, wasn't it, in 52, I think. So I think a great deal of what you have described is Winnicott's attempts to elaborate the depressive position in a way that does not have to accept anything of the paranoid schizoid position. Whereas Melanie Klein was saying the depressive position is a kind of a resolution of paranoid schizoid oppositions, differences, the spectrum created by the divisions, the schizoid divisions in the ego. So I suppose I'm saying that what strikes me from what you're saying is this particular attempt to stick to something like the depressive position, or a developed version of the depressive position, which doesn't have to accept the paranoid schizoid position. I suppose the question I want to ask is, how can destruction be benign, or how can the primitive mind of an infant conceive of a benign destructiveness? Yes, of course, as adults we can say, you have to break eggs in order to make omelets, and there's certainly one can understand the use of aggression having a positive tone to it. It's often captured in the difference between fighting for something as opposed to fighting against something. But this seems awfully nuanced for a very young baby. So one of the questions I would want to ask is, how can you help us to get into the mind of an infant that can feel destruction, whatever that is to an infant, can feel benign, whatever that means to an infant? And there was one other question. Well, I'll leave that for a moment, and or shall I ask the second question straight away?
If it's related, is it related?
Well, it's about Winnicott. I don't know that it's directly related.
You're tantalizing us now, Bob.
Okay. It is the difference between object relating and object usage. And I haven't really quite got it clear what the transition is from and what it is to. The baby starts without object relating because it doesn't distinguish self from object. Where does object relating come in the process from this, what do you call, a illusion of omnipotence, where there's there is no distinction between self and the outside world, and using an object which is felt as something that has its own psychic functioning, which can be in some way interrupted, destroyed, or whatever. Where does object relating come into that? Is when you talk about object relating, is it just a thing which doesn't have a psychic presence or a psychic aspect to it? So those are my two questions.
Well, what I tried to convey is that for Winnicot, object relating, he says in the use of an object that the subject has already allowed for some change to take place, but that change has only taken place in relation to the object. So whether the object is good enough or not good enough, and this comes back to his concept of health, you know, which we've talked about before, he was always really clear and absolutely adamant, actually, to the very end, that there was a difference between good enough and not good enough. And he wrote about that in Psychosis and Childcare in 1952. He says himself that was where he really clarified. So what he understood by this very line between health and pathology, and that he was always interested in that line. And I think there's a very fine line between the two, which is really how I started to think of non-survival of the object and survival of the object, and the intrapsychic non-surviving object and the intrapsychic surviving object. I think all of us have both, and hopefully throughout an analysis we develop our intrapsychic surviving object, which helps us develop ourself. I mean, that's something that I'm continually thinking about. And then we regress to non-survival of the object, because the mother is never perfect at the beginning, and that's why he came up with this term good enough. It was in response to what he felt everybody was at that time referring to the good internal object. He wanted to stake a claim, as it were, for the real woman, who was either good enough or not good enough. So it's the concept of health and the destruction. I think by the time we get to object relating, I think there has already been a good enough dynamic, psychic dynamic between mother and infant that is already creating in the infant a sense of trust. But there, in terms of the sequence of the 5 stages of the sequence, that hopefully happens maybe in even the first 24, 48 hours. And it's the foundation of survival of the object. It's an experience that the baby then subsequently evolves. So for him, paranoid schizoid position was a very good way of looking at failure at the very beginning. It wasn't universal. That was his argument. And this makes, I think, a big difference. Why are we discussing theories, and why do we have theories? I think it does make a big difference in one's approach to the patient. And I see it with my colleagues, that if you believe that there is a universal paranoid schizoid position in every single psyche, in every single individual, I think you approach the patient in a completely different way from approaching a patient who's either been severely traumatized or not. I think this does have a significant, makes a significant difference. I'll just say two more things. I think what you've said about really Winnicot having developed and elaborated the depressive position is quite an interesting, I think it's an interesting observation. And I think you're probably right, because I think he did always agree with Melanie Klein's version of the depressive position, but he revised it and he recalibrated it, if you like. He was interested in the capacity for concern and how one developed that capacity again, rather than the focus on the depressive, although he also was very interested in depression and how we mourned the object. And I just would like to say that I don't think he's a Kleinian. I think at root he's a Freudian. And I do think his analysis with James Strachey had an enormous influence on him. But as I've said in many papers, I think he was fascinated by Melanie Klein's theories, and was always in dialogue with them. And in Donald Winnicot today, I say in the introduction, without Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicot, there wouldn't be a Winnicot. Without Melanie Klein and Sigmund Freud and his dialogue between the two, there wouldn't be a Winnicot, there wouldn't be his theories. But they are very specific, and that's why I always argue that there are these three paradigms in the British Society: Kleinian, Winnicot's paradigm, and the Freudian paradigm. There was one more thing I was going to say about destruction. I think destruction is, I think it is very tricky. I used to teach it as deconstruction, but I think it has to be destruction. And that's why I use the metaphor of food. I think there is a healthy destruction of the object. And when we come and meet people like you and I, Bob, we destroy each other each time we discuss but that's a getting to know someone. It's like a getting, he wrote this wonderful paper in 1930 something, getting to know your baby. I think getting to know the other is a destruction and survival dynamic.
Okay, well, in what sense is it destructive? I can see possible meaning to that.
Because you don't say the same. When we switch off Zoom, I will carry on, and hopefully you will, and others, be influenced by each other, and we will go on intrapsychically working out on a conscious level what we said, but I think something else will happen on many different levels, which will destroy the imago we had of each other before. And this is where I prefer, I like the term imago. We have an imago of each other. And then when we come back, we've destroyed it, but it's a different one. It's a new one. And we get to know each other in a different way. That's how I think of it. Maybe other people in the audience disagree or...
Yes, I can see that the process of change, you're saying, involves letting go of something that you once thought and thinking something different. It's a huge extension of the word destruction, it seems to me, which embodies, the very word itself involves something that is rather aggressive. You pull down a building in order to build another one, and you actually use something pretty violent to destroy the old building that you're tearing down. Somebody has has talked about making a sculpture out of a stone, which is this real destruction? Isn't this a rather an extension of the word destroy? And wouldn't it be better if we used a different word to talk about the capacity to adapt to change? Yes, you and I are different. That doesn't mean we are oppositional and antagonistic.
It's not, I'm not saying,
No.
It's nothing to do with antagonism, or says she antagonistically. It's to do, I think he identifies a mechanism, a human mechanism. And I think that's what's exciting about it. But it only can work in with an external other surviving. But should we open it up now?
Could I just say that it does seem to me we could find another word to talk about changing one's views. Yes, of course it does involve a rearrangement of what we've already got in our minds. But does rearranging really mean destroying? Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. You can call it destroying, but it is destruction goes a long way the other way as well, to something like nuclear warfare. And wouldn't it be better to make some sort of distinction between the change in the process of a creative work or creative play, if you like, together on the one hand, and a nuclear war on the other hand?
Well, I think that's what I was saying. There's healthy destruction and pathological destruction.
Yeah,
but it has to be destruction. It does have. I think creativity involves destruction. Somebody in the chat has said something very interesting about the dialects of thesis and antithesis collide, and then a new thing comes out. A little of both destroyed, for example. That's
yes. This is a constructive dialectic. Yes, that's what I'm sort of saying. There's destruction where nothing survives, and destruction in the process of developing a creative progress onwards. I'm just a little bit pedantic, perhaps, in saying maybe it would be helpful to find different words for that. Can I just go back to another point where you talked about...
Bob, don't you think it would be good, there are chats coming through, don't you think it might be good for other people? Because I'm just aware of time. I don't want to take over chairing.
Yes. What time are we finishing?
Well, we haven't got a lot.
How much?
35. And
right.
Bharti,
we can go a little more than 8. So 8:15 or 8:20 we can close. So we have another hour to go if both of you are okay.
Well, we've got two possibilities. Either we open it up to people on the chat, or in some other way contributing from the audience, or Jan and I can go on trying to define our terms to each other.
Perhaps somebody would like to say something, because 35 minutes isn't a lot, is it?
Yes, you're very keen on finishing that stage, yes. What's the chat you want to talk about, Jan?
All right. So we open it to the floor and we have a perpetual dialogue going on where you people can discuss as well as other can also come in?
Yes.
All right. So the dialogue is open to all, and we can one by one, whoever wants to get into this dialogue can just have a show of hand and get in. And just to open it, it was very interesting what both of you were saying, especially when Jan was saying about knowing each other. Probably that is the process where two people actually start and get together and then merge into to make or create something new. So I don't know whether we call this merging of the sperm with egg. Is it a destruction or a creation? Is it death or is it life?
Mm.
So probably what Jan was saying was quite similar, and this came into my association about exactly this thing. And actually, this is just the beginning, wherein once the child comes in, that is where the fight begins, where it whose child is that, and whose principles and whose wishes and desires the child is supposed to follow. Well, it is just an opening, and probably I was just wondering while Bob was speaking about that helplessness and Jan was speaking about retaliation. In both these things, there is some other object is there. So it's a dyad. So even when the aggression or helplessness or retaliation is there, the retaliation is expected from some object. The helplessness is in relation to some object where the anticipation or the expectation is to get the help. And all these people, when they came about exploring around death, there was a real death. Probably they either felt helpless in face of death, whether it was Freud, whether it was Klein related to her own son's death, Freud, her daughter's death, and of course, the Germany, the Nazi Germany, and others. But when actually the death happens, it was just the self that dies. But here, the entire talk, actually, we are not talking about that. Probably what we were talking, and probably the others were too, it was actually the pain of somebody else dying and me not dying. And inferring the whole of the collage of whatever it is from that, inferring that of somebody else's death, from where Freud started with. Well, so we can take more chats. People are coming into.
I think Shmuel wanted to say something. I'd be very pleased to hear from you, Shmuel.
Now I'm muted. Well, thank you very much, both of you. I think this was very, very, very interesting. I wanted to. There are many things to be said. I mean, one thing to begin with is that I miss in this exchange between the two of you, between the Kleinian and the Winnicottian positions. What I miss is the Freudian. After all, the death drive is a Freudian concept. And as Bob has indicated, it was perhaps of all of Freud's writings, the one most difficult to accept, the one that met with the greatest resistance, especially by psychoanalysts. I think outside of analysis, there have been various ways of taking it up, which are interesting in themselves. But within psychoanalysis, for a long time, It was really rejected, and when not rejected, I think it was transformed. And I think in your discussion, both of you have really indicated that. In other words, it is such a difficult concept that it almost requires a transformation. As Freud said, the life instinct is much more easy to understand. It clamors, it's present. You can translate it into sexuality, other things, stimulation, etc. The death instinct works in the background. It has almost no manifestation. And Freud himself was looking for manifestation, and he, in my reading, was quite ambivalent about how it can be represented in a reified way, so to speak. And he said sadism is one example, destruction, aggression is another, but he said that's not all of it. So he himself had difficulty demonstrating what it means. And, I thought in terms of what Bharti was just talking about, it's also good to remember that the death instinct only exists in live individuals. When one is dead, there is no death instinct. In other words, it's part of life, of the biological life, biological existence, and so on. So I think we're coming down to transformations. On the one hand, we're into emotions. And I think Bob spoke about that, love and hate. Incidentally, Freud himself tried that. It didn't work that well. In one of the papers, he tries to translate it into love and hate. It's a little bit awkward. And Melanie Klein certainly took it into the realm of affect, of feelings, and so on. And that makes it probably much more amenable. But I think at the same time, it changes the concept, because the concept is of a drive that operates, as Bob indicated, essentially biologically, and then psychologically, as all drives. Incidentally, speaking of words, Bob, you used the term, which is the one, of course, Streicher uses, of the death instinct and the life instinct. And this is such a problematic term because it's not an instinct Freud talks about. It's a trieb, it's a drive, and it has a different meaning than instinct. But I won't go into that. So the translation or the transformation into destruction, aggression, and so on, which I think opens up new vistas in a way, but it does also takes us away from the death drive, at least as Freud conceived of it. So on the one hand, I think there's been some very creative usage of the term and opening new horizons, and on the other hand, a certain loss of what the original concept meant. And two more points I want to make. One is, as you probably remember and know better than me, that Freud also said that hatred of reality comes before the love of reality. And in that sense, the reality principle is before the pleasure principle. And it's because of the impingement of reality and the experience of destruction. So he was, in a way, on to that. And a final comment, I think it was Jan who spoke about the two babies. I thought that was very evocative, and it's very interesting. But I want to ask a question, at least in my thinking, and what I've tried to develop. I would like to suggest that actually these two babies are one baby. In other words, that the one baby experiences both relatedness that you were describing at the same time. And I think in psychoanalysis we've had some difficulty in taking that in, and so we separate the two. But I think in a way we have to think of it as existing in a parallel way at the same time in the same baby. And that's enough for me.
Thank you. I will respond briefly to that, Shmuel, because I think it's very interesting. All I would say is that I completely agree with you that the two babies are one. Only in the context of survival of the object will the first baby reach the second baby stage. And I think that was his point always. And that's why I think his whole emphasis on the parent-infant relationship in psychoanalysis is so crucial. Yeah. Thank you for all that you said. Yes, I think there was, I think it's a very interesting observation that actually what Bob and I have been talking about are, in the history of psychoanalysis, a kind of Winnicot transformation and Klein transformation of Freud's original death instinct, which I think, and it made me recognize that I think, as he says, Winnicott, in that last paper where he brings in the father, it's the use of an object in the context of Moses and monotheism, which I republished in Donald Winnicott today. He says very clearly he would like to relieve Freud of his most difficult concept, because, and it occurs to me as you spoke, that actually I think the use of an object was Winnicott's answer for Freud. Was like, you don't need the death instinct, here it is. This is my solution. But it also reminds me of the whole thing somehow in psychoanalysis. Do you believe in the death instinct or not? It's almost like it's a God. It's like the death instinct has become God. Yes, so thank you very much. I'm sure Bob would have another association to what you've said. The chat's also looking very interesting.
Yes, I think you've gone over the process, historical process. What I was trying to convey in the little presentation was that maybe the idea of the death instinct had gone beyond the limits of instinct theory, and that perhaps looking at human beings as motivated by emotions, by feelings in relation to others, external and imaginary ones, might take us a bit further with understanding this occupation with destructiveness, death. I mean, we've rather equated destructiveness with death, although Winnicott's backtracked from that, you're saying, Jan. But anyway, that was the kind of divergence more I was trying to justify, that if one moves towards an object relations point of view, feelings within the relations with others, maybe this can accommodate something of what Freud was struggling with the death instinct.
I wonder if people in the chat want to speak a bit more, because they've, especially this last one, are life and death mutually exclusive? I think this is a good question, because then we get away, we come to another transformation in a way from this sort of fixed idea of the life of the death instinct. To go back to the Hegelian dialectics, the synthesis of the thesis and antithesis is possible, as they are not mutually exclusive. Also, could it be that death is a new life? Which new life is death? And I think this does relate to psychic life and death as well, because this is also something Winnicot was very interested in. The fear of breakdown in the future is based on the breakdown in the past. The fear of death in the future is based on the psychic death, the psychic trauma, I would say, that the infant has experienced.
My sense still, Jan, would be is if you can talk in with not so much in terms of these technical words, but in terms of what it feel like to be benignly destructive, for instance. What's the state of the baby who has no words, no capacity to be subtle about these things? What does death mean to a baby?
Well, a quick answer would be the break in the continuity of being, what Winnicot refers to as unthinkable anxiety, falling forever, primitive agony. That's a quick. I've seen that some people's hands raised. Did you see?
Yes. Maybe take their questions. All right, Shubhranshu, you can go ahead. What do you want to ask?
Could we have the camera? Can they put the camera on?
Shubhranshu, can you hear us? All right, so next is Renita. Renita, you can ask your question.
Have you allowed them to unmute? They say they're not allowed to unmute.
Yes, they are. So Shubhranshu and Renita, both of you can unmute yourself.
Now I can unmute. Thank you, Bharti. First of all, thanks a lot for arranging such a great evening, here in Kolkata. So my question is, actually, I'm curious whether this phenomenon that concerns me a lot can be explained by whatever being discussed today. I often come across people who habitually go into the act of doing self-harm. Would the act of self-harm be interpreted as an act of, as a manifestation of erotic desire? If death instinct and life instinct, they could be interchanged so easily. I don't know whether, apparently it looks like harming self, but actually it is in some uncanny disguised way manifestation of an erotic urge and that occurred to me. I'm not sure whether I am making any sense or not. Thank you.
No, it's very, very helpful. Bob, do you mind if I answer first? I would say this is a very good question, because this takes us back to the clinic and the clinical situation. And it's very, very difficult working with people who are self-mutilating. I would say it's got nothing to do with the death instinct. What it's got to do with is a communication to the other about trauma. That would be my very quick answer. But in the session, what the analyst, of course, would want to explore are the fantasies of what happens to the patient. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they doing? And if I think 30 odd years ago, I worked with a young woman who in her first consultation pulled up her sleeves to show me both arms that were very, very scarred. And I was absolutely horrified. I mean, it frightened me actually and repulsed me because I couldn't imagine anybody wanting to do that. She stayed in analysis for 11 years and stopped cutting after about a year of analysis. So the following 10 years was really, she was quite young. She was in her 20s when she first came. And for her, the cutting was a relief of a feeling completely dissociated. So what she would say is that as she cut and saw the blood, she felt she was real. And it put her in touch with being real. And it's an extraordinary thing that, and it turned out that she'd had a really, really crazy early development, very traumatizing, very traumatic. And the way in which she dealt with it was to dissociate. And so this was her way of getting back. So once we got into the transference and she could work in the transference, as Winnicot says, as analysts and therapists, we help our patients get back to something that they've never been provided with in their early development. And I think because she stopped self-mutilating, it was the best we could do of that therapy. But I think everybody who does that will have a different fantasy or a different way of why they do that, a different way of articulating it. And so it needs to be done in the transference, countertransference, therapeutic relationship. Does that make sense?
All right, Renita, you can go ahead, and then Luis, you can go. Oh, okay. Yeah, Renita.
First of all, thanks to both of you, Dr. Abram and Dr. Hinselwood. It's just fantastic. I could have listened to this for the whole day, and you know, it's just wonderful. This is more a meta question. Dr. Abram mentioned Moses and Monotheism, which is one of my favorite books, and I've been struggling with this question for a while, both in my philosophy classes. I teach philosophy, and also because, you know, I'm a feminist, so I have a love-hate relationship with Freud. I love him and I can't stand him. With this whole death and life instinct, especially when I read his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it's becoming more and more a question for me, and I cannot resolve it. Are these analysts, these you know, great stalwart thinkers, do they assume time to be linear? Because time is linear only in some cultures. In other cultures, time is continuously circulating, it's circular. It's back to the same thing. And from a very post-colonial position, I mean, many, many cultures do not think of time as linear. Is that an assumption that all these analysts have? I know this is a meta question, but it's really bothersome for me because I was brought up almost schizophrenic between a colonial education, British education of linear time versus my own culture, which is more cyclic. So is that an assumption they make of life and death? Because, you know, in my culture, life and death, it's continuous, cycling. Destruction, creation, sustenance, destruction, creation, sustenance, destruction, till you attain some kind of. So that was my meta question, but thank you guys. It's just fantastic.
Thank you.
Can I just say, shall I say something about that? I think you're absolutely right that there are differences of across cultures. And one of the interesting things which we pay little attention to is how does psychoanalysis root itself in different cultures? I have no idea what a psychoanalysis would be like if we had a circular view of time. Yes, there's an assumption that that in the course of the time of an analysis, the patient will change. Although some people, I'm thinking of Bion, said, exclude all those sorts of thoughts from your mind, get rid of a desire to cure and so on, and just occupy yourself with trying to understand the moment that we're in right now. Of course, Bion was, for the first 8 years of his life, brought up in India. Did he have some carryover of that sort of proposition that you mentioned? I don't know. These things aren't, as far as I know, studied very much. And there you are. There's a research project that you can get going on. Yes, I have I'm in touch with a student at Essex University who's at the moment trying to think about beyond his ideas of getting rid of memory and desire, and how much this connects with a Buddhist form of meditation. I'm a little bit skeptical that there's very much correspondence, but there may be at different levels. It may be at the level of Bion having been in India, or it may be at the level of something general about human beings. So, in principle, yes, and the first answer is yes, and the second answer is go on, get on and study it.
Yes. Well, I think it's a fascinating question. By the way, next April, the European Psychoanalytic Federation are doing a symposium on time, and it's going to be hybrid. So look out on the website because that's going to be discussed. So your question's very stimulating. I think Winnicot probably was alluding to this circular concept of time, but for him, time is held by the mother, of course. So it's all through the mother that we have a sense of our time. I like the idea of Bion being brought up in India. That would have really really influenced him, especially because it was his ayah that was bringing him up, wasn't it, Bob? So he would have got it through her. Louise, you're in Australia.
Yes. Yes, Louise, you can go on. You are again unable to unmute yourself, but you can unmute yourself.
Something's happening with that unmute button.
Yes, I can now. Thank you. Yes, indeed, I am in Australia. And on the question of time, it's now 1:30 in the morning, so I'm not sure how articulate I will be. But firstly, Bharti, I wanted to thank you and the Indian Society for what a wonderful celebration of your 100 years this year. And thank you all for that. And look forward to on behalf of the Australian Society, we do look forward to seeing you in New Delhi in January 2023. So we'll be able to celebrate with you in person then. I would thank Bob and Jan for a wonderful discussion. what I wanted to go to is really the question, I think, of therapeutic action and the meaning of what you're talking about for therapeutic action. As I was listening to you, it seems to hinge around the object. From what Bob was saying in the Kleinian opus, the object is innate, and Klein's view of aggression seems to be in relation to the object and the fate of the object in the mind and how it's dealt with. And Jan, for Winnicot, you were talking about, in a way, aggressions in the service of creating self and object. And then I wanted to jump to Jan, you were talking about, in terms of the development, something about I take it, the internalization of the intrapsychic surviving object. And Bob, not tonight, but in some of your papers, you've written about on therapeutic action, on the internalization of the understanding object. And I just wondered, they're related to the goals of therapeutic action, the internalization of the surviving object or the internalization of the understanding object. And what do those differences actually mean for therapeutic action and for our notions of subjectivity? In the minutes we've got.
A big question, Louise.
And not in the minute, but that's what I'll go away and ponder on.
We ought to come to Australia and do a session on therapeutic action.
Well, we might. Our borders are closed, and
yes,
it's difficult to travel.
yes,
but maybe we'll have you online if you don't mind.
And I'm struggling very hard to think about how this connects with Death Instinct, and I'm not sure that I've got it. If it were the case that the conflict between libido and death instinct is best understood in the model of the emotions as a conflict between love and hate, then there is an expectation that therapeutic action will in some way support the internal imaginary sense of support from a loved object as opposed to the disintegrating effect of a hateful object. And it's a complicated discussion really about this the balance being moved in the mind from, well, as Winnicot would say, the continuity of a sense of existence as opposed to the sense of disintegration and death. Can one assume that that sense of a continuity comes from internalizing an understanding object? The movement in Kleinian ideas from Klein onwards is that understanding is a major element in the balance between love and life and disintegration and death. How does that work? Well, that's a complicated issue to do with the sense of disintegration and knowledge and understanding being a process of bringing things together in one's mind in a constructive and creative way, which represents something more like life. I don't know if that's too abstract to make much sense, but as I say, invite us to Australia to talk about that. But I think the short answer is that an understanding object is one that promotes the sense of integration and therefore balances away from death and disintegration. That would be the short answer.
Well, my short answer, because I realise we're getting to time, thank you very much, Louise, and I'm very honoured that you're still awake and here, is that the whole of the use of an object, I think, depicts therapeutic action. And what I have tried to evolve is the idea of how that takes place in the therapeutic encounter, and that the analyst has to always psychically survive, and that survival of the object is the identification of the mechanism of the therapeutic action, which I think Winnicot really evolved from his experience of analysis with Strachey, of course, who wrote that paper as Winnicot finished his analysis with him, the mutative interpretation. But thank you. There's much more to say, but it was a succinct answer. Lots of wonderful chat as well, but I can see we're running out of time.
Yes. So thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jan, for being with us, especially at this time when we are towards concluding our centenary celebrations. I'm really, really honored by your presence. And thanks to all of you, you have joined us today here with this webinar. We are very, very honored, and we look forward to all of you to join in another few of our webinars before we conclude finally in January next year. So it was a very, very pleasant and highly, highly evocative, not only the presentations, but the discussions too. And thank you again. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jan. Thanks to all of you.
And thank you for the chat, everybody. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you. Wonderful to be in Calcutta.
Yes.
If only we were in Calcutta, but
and our invitation for both of you to actually come to India in person.
We would love to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you everybody for listening, and meet you all again somewhere, Zoom or somewhere else.
Hopefully. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye, Bharti.
Bye-bye.
Bye.